European elections.
In manufacturing here in the region, we have a skills gap.
There is very little migration in those places as it stands.
Our political parties are afraid to tell people the truth.
The Euro election debate with Adrian Goldberg.
Very good morning to you. I'm Adrian Goldberg. Welcome to our special European election debate live from the mailbox in Birmingham on BBC WM, BBC Radio Shropshire and BBC Coventry and Warwickshire. With the European elections taking place next week, we're joined by a panel of 8 candidates who are looking for your vote. They'll be discussing the key issues around these elections: immigration, the economy, and whether we should stay in or out of Europe. Joining me in the studio are Dan Dalton from the Conservatives, Sean Simon from Labour, Phil Bennion from the Liberal Democrats, Jim Carver from UKIP, Will Duckworth from the Greens, Nikki Sinclaire from We Demand a Referendum Now, and Mike Nattrass from An Independence from Europe. We'll also be hearing from some of the other parties up for election during the debate. You can have your say too. Text the word Euro and then your message to 81333, or on Twitter, it's hashtag EuroBBC.
Have your say. Text the word Euro and then your message to 81333, or on Twitter, it's hashtag EuroBBC.
So let's start with a look at one of the key issues that this election is being fought on. Certainly one that grabs many of the headlines: immigration. In a moment, we'll hear what the candidates think. But first, here's our political reporter, Kath Stancheshan.
One of the big issues ahead of the European election is always immigration. The question of how many nationalities should be allowed an open border into Britain, or in fact whether any of them should. At the moment, all EU citizens must be able to come and live and work here. The same opportunity is given to British citizens elsewhere in Europe. Views vary wildly about just how necessary foreign workers are to our economy. And as the EU grows and more countries become members, the argument that we're already full becomes more urgent. According to Oxford University's Migration Observatory, the number of people in the West Midlands who were born in another country has risen dramatically since 1995 by more than 60%. Of course, that includes immigration from all over the world and not just Europe, although Poland is still the biggest sender of foreign citizens. The idea of a mass invasion of Romanian and Bulgarians, though, earlier this year hasn't really materialised. So what's the impact? Dr. Catherine Tonkis is an expert in European migration at Birmingham University.
In a place like Birmingham, there's already a lot of migration. There are generations of migration. And so Eastern European migration and European migration in general fits within a greater diversity in the city and perhaps is less noticeable, although it is a new dynamic. In perhaps some of our more rural areas, it's having more of a dramatic effect because there is very little migration in those places as it stands.
The Euro election debate.
And you're listening to this special Euro election debate this morning on BBC WM, BBC Radio Shropshire and BBC Coventry and Warwickshire, asking at this point in the debate, is European migration good for us here in the West Midlands, or has it damaged us as a region? Let's speak first to Dan Dalton from the Conservatives, because Dan, I know that David Cameron has said today that the free movement of labour, as far as he is concerned, is non-negotiable in Europe.
Yeah, but I think the key thing is when people are coming here because they want to work and they want to better themselves and they want to offer something to the British country, I think that's vitally important. It helps our country and it helps everything. And from that point of view, it is really important. The problem comes when people are coming here because the benefits they can receive here are higher than the money they will get from a graduate level job in their capital city, and that's where the issue is. So while free movement of people is a part of the EU treaties, free movement of people for benefits is not. It's absolutely not part of that, and that's one of the key parts of our renegotiation strategy, and we have allies in the rest of Europe who will hopefully work with us to try and make these changes.
We'll have listeners all across our region today who may feel that they have had their job prospects undermined because someone has come in from another part of Europe, possibly Eastern Europe, and at the very least driven down their wages.
Well, I mean, if you talk to most economists will say this lump of labour fallacy isn't true. When immigration and when people come to the country, there's not a set number of jobs in this country. Often they create more jobs. And I think this is one of the fallacies with economics that we need to get right, and one of the things that UKIP is saying that we need to challenge, because it's not the case that there's a fixed number of jobs in this country. It's not the case that there's a fixed wage for people in this country.
Let's bring in UKIP at that point then. Jim Carver, as you've been specifically mentioned there by Dan from the Conservatives. There is not a fixed lump of labour that foreign workers from the EU, Jim, are taking away from workers in the West Midlands.
What there is, Adrian, is open border policy to up to 485 million people. And what UKIP campaign for, let's make this straight, we are not an anti-immigration party, but we very much prefer the Australian model of controlled migration. Of course, we need to welcome people in from the right skill base, but not just from the 28 member states of the European Union. Let's reach out, Birmingham, where we are today, is a very diverse city. We have huge links with our Commonwealth countries through various communities in Birmingham. It strikes me that this open door policy is very unfair on our traditional ethnic minority communities, where an unskilled worker can arrive from, say, Bulgaria or Romania, but somebody who wishes to come and work in the UK from a Commonwealth country has to jump through hoops. And let's be very clear, this whole idea of uncontrolled migration, it is the working class it affects. There can be no doubt that too much unskilled labour keeps wages low, and with youth unemployment at 20% in this country, the answer is not open door migration.
So that's Jim Carver from UKIP. So Sean Simon from Labour. Jim is saying that what he regards as uncontrolled EU immigration affects the working classes, the group of people who the Labour Party has traditionally represented.
What affects the working classes is the economy in this country. The truth is that we had a massive influx of Polish migrants in about 2006 under Labour, when we had full employment and a prosperous economy, when we were on then about probably the 51st of what turned out to be 60-something consecutive uninterrupted quarters of economic growth. Now, was there a catastrophe? Was there an outcry? Was there a big problem? No, absolutely not at all. We absorbed 1 million Poles in an incredibly quick period of time, doing productive, useful work in the economy. And then the global financial crash happened, and most of them went back. I live in Erdington in Birmingham, and there's been traditions, as I have right across Birmingham, of waves of migration. When I was a kid, they used to call it County Erdington. In the middle of the 2000s, you'd have thought it was Silesian Erdington. Now it's back to being more like it was before.
So just so I'm clear then, Sean, you're completely relaxed then about what your opponents would characterise as an open border Britain within the EU?
The truth is, I mean, Jim says there's 485 million people in the EU. There's 2.2 million British people living in the rest of the EU. Now, if we want to bring these borders down, and everybody here will say, oh, no, nobody's talking about sending everybody back, which is what they say in these debates, but don't say on most of their literature. Sure, nobody's talking about sending everybody back, but can we be sure that the French and the Spanish and the rest of Europe, there's nearly 1 million largely elderly British people living in southern Spain, putting a massive strain on the Andalusian health system. Now, the truth is, all of those people will come back. You won't want to worry about who's taking your jobs. 2.2 million Brits who'll be coming back if these people have their way. They'll be taking your jobs.
OK, let me ask Phil Bennion from the Liberal Democrats. Is European migration good for us here in the West Midlands, or has it damaged us as a region?
Overall, it's good for us. All economists will tell you that skill shortages damage the economy. And this is why the United States does better than the European economy. So the theory behind this is that by people being able to move to where the work is, that the whole economy will do better.
So you say that because the United States is open to immigration, it hasn't. But doesn't the United States have a rather more rigorous immigration system with its green card than the European Union does within its own borders?
No, I think you've misunderstood me. I mean, people can move across the entire US economy from state to state, from coast to coast. It's a very, very large economy, and it corrects itself. But in Europe, we have obviously language barriers and other barriers. But what we have seen in the UK, for instance, in 2013, we added 400,000 private sector jobs, and 380,000 British people came off the unemployment register. So this isn't a zero-sum game. Dan's absolutely right. So we need to keep this in mind. This sort of simplistic view that by letting immigrants in, we actually damage the British economy and put British people out of work is simply not correct. And another point I want to say, just before I finish, is that the immigrant community, and I've been involved with the Birmingham University people in looking at this, are actually running a budget surplus when we are still running a budget deficit.
OK, you've made that point. Thank you. That's Phil Bennion from the Liberal Democrats. 13 minutes past 11. Adrian Goldberg here. You're listening to a special European election debate live on BBC WM, BBC Radio Shropshire and BBC Coventry and Warwickshire. If you want to have your say, you can send us a text to 81333. Don't forget to start the message with the word Euro, or on Twitter, we're at #EuroBBC. Let me ask Nikki Sinclaire from We Demand a Referendum Now then about whether immigration has benefited or has damaged our local economy here in the West Midlands.
Well, this is another reason, Adrian, why we do need a referendum sooner rather than later. And the polls have constantly shown this is the area that people want renegotiation on our EU membership, and probably one of the main reasons why people want to leave the European Union. And Dan says, well, they've got friends to renegotiate, other countries. But the fact about the European Union, to change any treaty, you have to have unanimity. You only need one country to say no, and you cannot have it. You're shaking your head, but that's an absolute truth. I'm sure all my other colleagues would share this. But let's remember, the biggest thing about this debate, and I think we need controlled immigration. Remember, Gordon Brown called that woman a bigot. The Labour Prime Minister called the woman a bigot because she challenged him on this. And Ed Miliband apologised, because he said the Labour Party got it wrong. 14,000 people the Labour Party said would come in. In fact, it was over 1 million. That's the reality. We've got no control over our borders. It's about time that the main parties got this serious, and we don't need to be racist like UKIP about this. We just need to be straightforward and have a proper debate about controlled immigration into this country.
Will Duckworth for the Greens.
Well, it's undoubtedly true that we have an awful lot of migration throughout Europe. It's not just immigration. And when we go over to the continent of Europe, we can cross over borders perfectly freely, and it's really wonderful. There's also no doubt whatsoever that people don't come over here to claim benefits. You wouldn't leave your home and your family to come somewhere to claim 70 quid a week in benefits if you could get that. They contribute so many more times to the economy than they take out. It's unbelievable. If there's a problem with jobs, wages and housing, it's a problem caused by successive governments, not a few people coming to work here for pittance wages. And UKIP started the argument, and the other parties have joined in, and they are making migrants to this country feel uncomfortable. They're making some of them suffer from racial abuse in the streets that they weren't getting 10 or 20 years ago, and they're making people feel that we're no longer a welcoming country. We actually don't need tolerance and acceptance of people coming into this country. We need respect, appreciation, and to celebrate their diversity.
OK, Will, thank you. Will Duckworth from the Green Party. What about Mike Nattrass from An Independence from Europe?
Government is about managing the country. It's not about open doors with no plan and no control. We have to plan social services, housing, hospitals and schools. When you have unlimited people coming into the country, it's impossible to know what's going to happen next year. The same rules should apply to Europeans as it does to the Commonwealth, and we are trying to embrace the Commonwealth because we believe that's a better market than Europe. And the answer, of course, is to issue work permits. First, local people who want to employ should be allowed to offer the jobs locally. If there is no input there, then they should be allowed to ask for work permits to bring people in from abroad. We're not against immigration. We're for controlled immigration into this country to suit our economy. And I'm at the top of the ballot paper.
Let me put the point that Mike's read there to Dan Dalton. That was Mike Nattrass there. You heard from An Independence from Europe. Let me put this point to Dan Dalton from the Conservatives. Mike saying that with the best will in the world, if you don't know how many people are coming into the country, then how can you plan valuable resources and allocate them to schools, hospitals and so on all over the West Midlands?
Well, yeah, I mean, We do know who's coming into the country. I mean, often the problem is we don't always know who's leaving the country. And that's very difficult. But we know who's coming into the country.
We don't always know in numbers of people, do we? We don't know from one year to the next whether somebody might travel from Poland or from another part of Eastern Europe or from Germany or Spain to live in this country. We can't know that because people will make their individual decisions, won't they?
And we do know because we still do. I mean, you're talking about the fact that we have... People are saying we have open... Hold on. People are saying we have open borders here. That's simply not true. We're part of the Schengen Agreement. To come into the UK from any European country... We're not part of the Schengen Agreement. So if you come into the UK, you will need to show your passport. They will check you in. We know who's coming into the country. The problem is often the time we don't know who's coming out of the country and we don't know how long people are staying in the country.
What about Sean from Labour, Sean Simon, this planning issue? Is it a real issue?
It's one of those things that it sounds like a real issue, but when you think about it, of course it's not a real issue. So, for instance, the GDP, the income per head and the cost of living and the general wealth is approximately twice in London and the South East as it is in the North East. Now, does everybody from Newcastle just turn up and live in London? No, they don't. And why? They could get more money, blah, blah, blah. All the same arguments apply. Why do they not? They don't, because they live in Newcastle. They live in Newcastle. And is there a crisis of planning in London because they don't know how many people are going to move from Birmingham? Is there a catastrophe in Dudley because people might turn up from Skegness? Of course there's not. Of course we don't know for certain who's... No, there isn't at all. What? There is a catastrophe in Dudley because they don't know how many people are going to turn up from Skegness. In London there's a problem.
There is a problem in London. There is a problem in London.
There are all kinds of problem in London, but I can tell you that there is not a problem in London of planning of people coming in from Dudley and Skegness and Newcastle. Not at all.
Let me put the point.
That's nonsense. The truth is that you never know for certain what's going to happen in the future, but you can predict an awful lot of the future from what's happened in the past.
That's why Ed Miliband apologised.
OK, we'll leave that particular debate from there. As I say, if you want to join in, you can send us a text message to 81333 and text the word Euro, or on Twitter, it's hashtag EuroBBC. Now, as well as the 7 candidates that we've got in the studio today, you will also have the option of voting for other parties in the European elections. So let's hear a bit about one of those. Derek Hilling is standing in the West Midlands for the English Democrats.
Not only is England a member of the European Union, but England is also a member of the United Kingdom. The English Democrats were formed in 2002 because we believe that England is getting a raw deal from devolution. And our policy now is that we want an independent England. We want England to be independent not only of Europe, but of all the nations within the United Kingdom. So we're going into this election offering the people of England an opportunity to say no to Europe, but also no to the UK.
There you go. That's Derek Hilling, who is standing for the English Democrats. I should say we did invite Michael Coleman from the BNP to come to this debate today here. Unfortunately, he has not turned up. You are listening to a special European election debate live here on BBC Coventry and Warwickshire, BBC Radio Shropshire and BBC WM. I'm Adrian Goldberg. The voices that you're hearing in the studio are Dan Dalton from the Conservatives, Sean Simon from Labour, Phil Bennion from the Liberal Democrats, Jim Carver from UKIP, Will Duckworth from the Greens, Michael Coleman from the BNP is not here, unfortunately, as we mentioned, Nikki Sinclaire from We Demand a Referendum Now, and Mike Nattrass from An Independence from Europe. And as I've mentioned, you can take part in the debate by texting the word Euro and then your message to 81333, or you can comment on Twitter and use the hashtag EuroBBC. James Boville has been looking at some of the texts and comments coming in. James.
Yeah, Adrian, plenty of people talking on Twitter this morning. Lots on the immigration issue using that hashtag EuroBBC. Peter's got in touch, pointing to figures that he says show immigrants are less likely to claim benefits than UK citizens. Gordon says UKIP posters claim foreign workers drive wages down. Big bosses would not put wages up if they were to leave. And Alan says immigration is entirely necessary and is to be welcomed. The NHS would collapse without it. Plenty still coming through. You've got some time to get in touch. You can use the hashtag EuroBBC or text 81333. Start your message with Euro.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed, James Boville. It's the text number 81333. Text the word Euro at the start of it, or on Twitter, it's hashtag EuroBBC. So what does being in or out of Europe mean for our economy and our workforce? Our reporter Jay Vidalingham has been asking that very question.
It's estimated that around £19 billion of business is generated annually by the West Midlands trading with the rest of the EU. And there's an argument that the provision of jobs is the single biggest reason that Britain shouldn't break with Brussels. Pro-Europeans say it's absolutely essential for our economy. After all, why wouldn't we want to be part of the pulling power of the biggest single market in the world? 28 countries, 500 million people. They say businesses would struggle without the free trade agreements that come with the EU, and exports could suffer. Ranjit Singh runs technology company Genie World in Wolverhampton.
We'll be having to look at the trade barriers between each country, and there's a lot more complexity in terms of paperwork for organisations such a small business such as ourselves, whereas now we can look at Europe as one country in terms of our exports.
But Eurosceptics say we could trade perfectly well on our own. In fact, maybe we'd even be able to buy and sell smarter without the EU, that we were doing it before, so why can't we do it again? Shropshire farmer David Mills thinks being in Europe has made life difficult for his industry because of the numerous regulations brought in by politicians in Brussels.
Most of my farming career has been within Europe. We saw Europe as an expansion zone for further marketing of our products. Equally, we have to be fair and accept some of theirs back the other way. But equally, we've had the regulation of area payments, domination over how we're to farm, told what we can and can't do, and that gets a little bit annoying after a while.
The Euro election debate.
So then it's 11:24. I'm Adrian Goldberg, a special European election debate here on BBC Radio Shropshire, BBC Coventry and Warwickshire, and BBC WM. So would it damage our economy if we came out of Europe? Let's get a word with Phil Bennion from the Liberal Democrats, because Phil, your party is probably seen as perhaps the most EU friendly of all of the major parties. What would the impact be if we did quit the EU?
Yeah, well, the impact is going to be profound on our exporting businesses. It's not just the fact that we export to Europe. We export across the world. But our big manufacturers, they are actually producing not just for the European market, not for the British market, for the European market, and it's very, very important for them to be actually part of the single market. There's a big difference between access to the single market and actually being part of it. Being part of it means you can put goods on a lorry, they can go anywhere across Europe, Italy, France, Germany, without any questions asked. Access to the single market simply means you've got a trade agreement with it, which is very, very different. Some people think we can take the Norway-Switzerland option. We cannot. If we take the Norway option, we will be paying just as much into the European Union now as we do now. The Switzerland option is not open to us.
So many listeners might not know what the Norway and Switzerland options are, but you're saying essentially we've got to be fully in as a member of the EU club to make full advantage of the benefits of being in that club.
Yes, and of course, companies like Jaguar Land Rover, it is not just simply so they can sell across the European market without any barriers, without any borders whatsoever, and that is very important in itself. But also, they have a voice. They have a voice when European legislation is changed. They will lose that voice if we lose, and that's very important to them.
What about that then, Jim Carver from UKIP? You know, this is what we would stand to lose if this country, and here in the West Midlands, we were not part of the European Union.
Well, we've heard it all before, Adrian, haven't we? We heard in the run-up, it's exactly the same people who are peddling these scary stories about Britain being outside the European Union and what damage it would do to British industry. It's exactly the same people who said, if we don't join the euro, we're going to go down the pan. Let's actually go back to that debate. And Lamberto Dini, who was a former Italian premier, said at the time, there's a great danger that if Britain doesn't join the single currency, she will end up as the offshore Hong Kong of Europe. And I really believe that applies even more, because outside the European Union, we can rekindle our links and trade globally. Let's make no bones about this. The over-bureaucratic internal market within the European Union is shrinking, and we need to be reaching out to a wider world. The emerging markets, rekindling our links with the Commonwealth, looking to extend business links further with Brazil, with China, with Vietnam, with the emerging markets. The world is our oyster. Regrettably, this burden of bureaucracy, this burden of regulation, which we heard from the farmer in Shropshire, is just one example. I'm a small businessman. I do business with companies on the other side of the world at a press of a button. And let's remember at the end of the day, it is not countries that trade with countries, it is companies that trade with companies.
Jim Carver from UKIP, thank you. Sean Simon from Labour.
Well, as Jim says, it's companies that trade with companies, and every single major business organisation in the United Kingdom and almost all the major businesses and small business organisations that have expressed an opinion on it very strongly and unequivocally say it will damage our business if we're not in the European Union, because this is the richest single market in the world. We need access to it, we need influence on it, everything that Jim said, that Phil said. And Jim says, quotes Lamberto Dini, who is a frankly dodgy Italian politician, and saying that if we're lucky, we can leave the EU and become Hong Kong. Well, I say to Jim and Lamberto Dini, if he's still alive, firstly, it's a fantasy to imagine that we would be Hong Kong, and secondly, I don't want to be Hong Kong. Britain is not some offshore tax haven. Right. Britain is one of the world's great financial centres. It's one of the world's great trading nations. We can do a lot better in the United Kingdom than being Hong Kong. Sure, and one of the things that enables us to do better is being a part of the large, rich, single European market of half a billion people.
We heard, though, didn't we, from that farmer in Shropshire talking about the bureaucratic burden that the EU can place on business, not just farmers, but also on more industrial businesses as well.
Of course he does, and the EU does place a bureaucratic burden on businesses, on farmers in particular, because the farming business is particularly connected financially with the EU. All governments place a burden on business. That's part of the trade-off of having a regulated, orderly market and living in a decent society. The market works, the market creates wealth, but leave it completely to its own devices, and it doesn't work. It creates less wealth, and it creates terrible unfairness and inequality. That's why we need regulation. Not heavy, not too much, not so that it crushes businesses, but good regulation that enables people to work well and make a good living.
Sean Simon from Labour there. What about that then, Mike Nattrass, and independents from Europe? Brussels often criticised for the burden of regulation, but actually Sean Simon saying, look, this is about good governance and ensuring a level playing field.
We should be about world trade, and we should be about the World Trade Organisation rules, not the petty European regulations, because we've always been a world trader, and that's how we should stay. With petty European regulations, we stand a good chance of our financial centres being closed. So I don't know what that was all about. We are world traders in that respect, not just Europeans. In fact, our main competition comes from within Europe. We should be improving Commonwealth ties. We mentioned motor cars. 55% of car exports out of the UK go outside of the EU. And let's face it, if we leave the European Union, they will still trade with us. Of course they will. We are a massive market for them. If they said, we're not trading with you, what will we do? Say, well, we're not trading with you. And they would be the losers. How are they going to stop sending us BMWs and all the rest of the stuff?
That's Mike Nattrass from an Independence from Europe. How do the Greens see it, Will Duckworth?
Well, of course, the vast majority of the things we sell and buy are produced in this country anyway and sold within this country anyway. And we need to make sure that we are buying British food and not having things flown halfway across the world. But we've managed quite well in Europe so far. We're the 6th or 7th richest country in the world, but we do need to make sure that the people are benefiting of that. And of course, we have to remember that one person's bureaucratic regulations is somebody else's protections for workers' rights, animal welfare and the environment. But this is why we actually need a referendum, I think. There is a huge amount to be debated, and people
but
need
in that
to know the
referendum,
facts.
just so I'm clear, though, from a Green perspective, you still believe that we should be part of the European Union, though?
Yes, definitely. But I think to solve the problems of businesses wondering, are we going to be in, are we going to be out, we need to actually have a debate, a full debate about that, because this is European Parliament's, remember, and we're not deciding now whether we go in or out. We need that debate, and then we need to vote to stay in.
Nikki Sinclaire from We Demand a Referendum Now. I've heard business leaders saying the whole business of having a referendum in itself adds to business uncertainty. It puts off investors, because what investors want more than anything is certainty. If we do have a referendum, won't that in itself be bad for business?
That's the folly of David Cameron's position of saying 3 years' time. You're creating 3 years' uncertainty. That's why we need a referendum sooner rather than later, because we've been arguing about this for 25 years, and I think it's detrimental to this country, and it's a democratic issue. We need this answer once and for all. Now, on the cost on the single market, I think it's been said. I think the main parties speak, but the ordinary people in the street listening to this can see that there's German and French cars, etc., on the streets. We have a deficit of payments with the European Union. We buy far more off them than they buy off us. Look, 80% of all trade in the UK is internal. We do not have power in this country to have a trade agreement with any country in the world. We have to go on what's best for 28 countries. Who gave that power away? Did the people consent to that? A Cardiff University study has shown that the European Union costs the average family £26 per week, £8.50 on their food bill. Who's asked for that? That's why we need a referendum now, and that's what I'm campaigning for.
That's Nikki Sinclaire from We Demand a Referendum Now. Dan Dalton from the Conservatives. Would it damage our economy, both our industrial base and also the rural parts of our region, if we quit the EU?
Well, look, what we've heard so far is 100% in or 100% out. And even at the moment, we don't have that situation in the European Union. We are not in the euro, we are not in Schengen. And that shows, once and for all, that we can pick and choose to a certain extent what we take from the European Union. And from our point of view, it is absolutely key, the internal market. There is no doubt about that is of huge benefit to this region particularly, but to the UK as a whole. If we are not in the internal market and we do not have a say over the rules governing the internal market, that will be hugely difficult for the UK economy. However, what we're saying is we don't want everything else that goes with that. We don't want ever closer union, and we believe that we can go and renegotiate with partners in Europe to get the sort of relationship that Britain wants, and then we will put that to the British people in a referendum, and they will decide whether they're happy with this renegotiation or not.
Which bits...
We get one thing very sorted, very clear, and I'm sure Phil Benyon, which is the opposite opinion to me, will agree with this. To get anything changed by treaties, it's not the case, Phil, that you have to have unanimity of all 28 member states on a treaty change.
Yes.
Is that
on a treaty change? In the end, yes, you have to get unanimity. That depends on whether it needs a treaty change or not. Obviously.
Jim, let Phil Benyon speak. I'll let you come back. Go on, Phil Benyon from the Liberal Democrats.
It does depend on whether you want a treaty change or not. Whether you need a treaty change or not. You can get certain things changed without a treaty change. But I think that getting a special deal for Britain will be difficult. But I think that and a treaty change that will give reform for all, I think will take till about 2020. I don't think we can get that by 2017.
Well, let me ask,
that is my view.
Let me ask Dan Dalton from the Conservatives
but Nikki is right that it is the uncertainty is damaging the economy now.
Let me ask Dan Dalton from the Conservatives. You said, the things that we don't like about the European Union, we can renegotiate. From a Conservative point of view, what are those things?
Well, the first thing is we want to get out of the commitment to ever closer union. That is key. We want to...
Treaty change. It's a treaty
change. Come on, he's let you have your say. Can you let him have his say, please?
We want to get out and ensure that we're out for good of things like the Euro bailout fund. Now, we have already got out of that, and we got out of that without a treaty change. We got national control back over fisheries without a treaty change, and we got the EU budget down without a treaty change. So all this thing on the treaty change is not true. There's a huge amount you can do without that.
Jim Carver from UKIP. Go on, you wanted to make a point.
I mean, that's pretty rich coming from the party that's in the European Parliament. All their MEPs voted for further enlargement of the European Union. Let's be very clear about this. Let's actually listen to what the real powerhouses in Europe will say. And I'm sitting next to a pro-European Liberal Democrat who I'm sure will agree with me. We've all heard what Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, said with regards to the renegotiation. She said it's not an option. We've all heard what Jose Manuel Barroso, the President of the European Commission, has said. It is not an option. And indeed, Viviane Reding, his deputy, said last week it's not an option. And I've got to agree with the Liberal Democrats. There are now only two clear positions to be on with regards to Britain's relationship with Europe. You can't have your feet in both camps, Dan. It's all in or all out. Can I
ask Sean Simon from a Labour point of view, Sean, given that Labour is the one party that's not advocating a referendum on the EU, or one of the main parties anyway, not advocating a referendum on the EU, are you broadly happy with the EU as it is constituted?
We think the EU needs change. Being in the EU is a process of constant negotiation. It's not a static thing. It's a constantly moving, constantly changing thing. And you constantly renegotiate the institutions in the same way that you constantly negotiate for the best deal on whatever subject it is for your country. But what people should be clear about is that this election to the European Parliament has actually got nothing to do with any of these issues. None of the people... If I can just let me speak, instead of shouting people down, just let me speak. None of the people elected to the European Parliament have any power to make any changes to these things. These are matters for national government. If people feel very, very strongly that they want a referendum on the EU, or they want to renegotiate, or any of the kind, or they want to leave the EU, the time to make those feelings felt is in the general election next year, when the people that you send to Parliament and will form part of national government who will actually have the power to make those changes. MEPs have no power to make those changes. They're the people actually legislating in an actual Parliament that actually exists and do things now. That people need to vote for people who share their values to represent them in the system that we've got now. If you want to change the system, the time to make that feeling felt is in the general election.
Very briefly, Mike Nattrass from an Independence from Europe.
Well, at the general election, we're then told this isn't a European election, and we're told to shut up about it because it's not even on the list. And I've been through a few like that. Let me just say that President Barroso stands up in the Parliament and he says, and this is what he does say, he says, this is the new European empire into which you have all pooled your sovereignty. It's time to get out. We didn't vote to pool our sovereignty. We voted for a trade agreement, and now under world trade rules that isn't even necessary.
OK, Mike Nattrass,
time to leave.
An Independence from Europe. Go on, Dan Dalton from the Conservatives.
Well, if you want a referendum, which is the only path to leaving the European Union, there's only one party that can deliver that. Labour and Lib Dems have made it clear that they don't really want a referendum. UKIP can't deliver because you need an Act of Parliament to have a referendum, and you need nearly 330 MPs, which I'm afraid even if they do well next year, they're not going to get 330 MPs.
That's Dan Dalton from the Conservatives. I'm Adrian Goldberg. This is a special election debate live from the mailbox in Birmingham, going out on BBC Coventry and Warwickshire, BBC Radio Shropshire and BBC WM. We're hearing what the candidates in the studio think. They won't be the only ones, though, that you'll be able to vote for in the European elections. Let's hear now from one of the other parties. Dave Nellist is from No to EU.
The European Union was not set up to benefit ordinary working people. There are some who will argue that certain working time directives and certain health and safety regulations have been brought in which can benefit layers of working people. They've only been brought in on the basis of big employers not wanting to be undercut by cheaper employers. When it's come to the big questions of the day, should we have public ownership of water, of transport, of mail, of health, of education? The EU stands for privatisation, and the big companies taking charge of those services. We stand for the opposite.
There you go. That's Dave Nellist from No to EU. Adrian Goldberg here on BBC Radio Shropshire, BBC Coventry and Warwickshire and BBC WM with a special European election debate. In the studio, we're hearing from Dan Dalton from the Conservatives, Sean Simon from Labour, Phil Bennion from the Liberal Democrats, Jim Carver from UKIP, Will Duckworth from the Greens, Michael Coleman from the BNP couldn't be with us, Nikki Sinclaire from We Demand a Referendum Now, and Mike Nattrass interest from and independence from Europe. And you can take part in the debate by texting the word Euro and then your message to 81333, or you can comment on Twitter using the hashtag EuroBBC. James Boville is checking out some of your texts and comments. James.
Thanks, Adrian. Plenty of reaction coming in. Mervyn on the text says, when pro-Europe politicians realise how out of touch they are with the electorate and witness a huge victory for the UKIP in the election, will they just please disappear quietly? Rogers got in touch to say we should be governed by those elected in Westminster, not by people in Brussels. Sharon has texted in to say it's time we charged for non-UK born people to use our NHS, including them buying their own private insurance. We have to when we leave our shores. On the issue of how secure our borders are, another texter says, you don't have to show your passport at Calais. I recently witnessed people showing only their driving licences to gain entry. Lydia on Twitter says, why don't we ever see our MEPs? I've only ever seen Nikki Sinclair's mobile surgery. Jane asks, if elected, do any of them promise to speak up for the Midlands in Europe, or will they just party bash? And finally, Stephen on Twitter says, clearly some of the MEPs are out of touch. Immigration is an issue.
Thanks very much indeed, James Boville. You can add your voice as well. Text a message to 81333. Start it with the words Euro, or on Twitter, we're at the hashtag EuroBBC. Now, in a moment, we'll be rounding up today's debate and asking the candidates in the studio whether we should stay in or get out of Europe. We were supposed to be talking about the economy a few minutes ago, but they managed to turn that into a bit of an in or out debate, but we'll focus on that more shortly. First, though, our political reporter, Castan Cheshan, looks at both sides of the argument.
It has around 500 million inhabitants, a budget of more than 130 billion euros, and it's even won a Nobel Peace Prize. But since the European Union was formally established in 1993, it's been a constant source of controversy. Britain entered what would become the EU in 1973. Ever since then, there have been politicians who've tirelessly campaigned to get Britain out. The basic pro-Europe argument centres on the fact that having joined up European countries means we can do lots of things more easily, things that benefit Britain, like travelling freely, the creation of jobs and buying and selling things to other countries. The anti-Europe point of view is based on the fact that Britain gives up some of its power by being in Europe. There are certain rules we have to follow because Brussels says so, even if that's not always how our own government would do it. In the West Midlands, there are mixed views. Richard Halstead, the Midlands Regional Director of the manufacturers' organisation EEF, says his members are broadly pro-Europe, but there are issues.
We feel that being in is better than being out, but we're not saying all's rosy. There are things that need to happen better. Regulation in Europe. We need to kill red tape. We need to be more joined up in the European Parliament. There are 28 commissioners in the European Parliament. If we could cluster those into focused areas, then we'd be much more efficient.
The Euro election debate.
Very telling, isn't it, that our debate about the economy and whether being in or out of the EU was good for the West Midlands defaulted almost to a kind of in or out debate. But Will Duckworth, from a Green Party point of view, in or out?
I think we've got to remain in eventually, because there are so many vitally important things that come through Europe. There's workers' protection, there is animal protection. There is no point in us having regulations about the way we bring up our farm animals if in Belgium and France they're completely ignoring it. We've been in Europe and we've been leading the animal welfare debate, and we're taking the rest of Europe with us. If we get out, we are facing the drastic, horrible possibility of dreadful animal rights protection over there, and then our supermarkets buying cheap meat from over there, destroying our economy.
Although
and
listeners might think, well, you know, if we care so much about workers' rights, if we care so much about animal rights, can't we, in Britain, through the Houses of Parliament, legislate for those in this country?
We can, but what I'm saying is if we have a standard of animal welfare in this country and European countries don't, then our big supermarkets and our big businesses are going to import from there. They're not going to worry about our rights compared to those. They're just going to worry about the cheapest. And
okay,
Dave Nellis,
let me put those points to Jim Carver from UKIP then. You know, workers' rights are protected across the European Union. Animal rights are protected across the European Union. From the Green point of view, those are good reasons to stay in.
Adrian, the great strength of British democracy is its accountability. if we don't like what our politicians do, as we didn't with Mr Brown in 2010 and what we didn't with Mr Major in 1997, it's very simple. We don't vote for them. We vote them out. 75% of the laws that govern the productive sector of British law now emanate in the form of a directive or some sort of legislation in Brussels. And we've heard it said today from many people around the table, the only way you can renegotiate and achieve a change is with total unanimity. That is not going to happen within the European Union. And it's very simple. If a British government wants to pass a law, whether it be on animal welfare, whether it be on job security or job protection, the great strength is, if that legislation doesn't work, the following government can repeal that legislation and introduce something similar. That safety guard just does not apply within the European Union. And, of course, the elephant in the room, of course, is the Lisbon Treaty itself. The Lisbon Treaty is a self-amending treaty. So it's now clear that the only way Britain can regain control of her sovereignty is to withdraw from the European Union.
Dan Dalton from the Conservatives, then. We've heard this claim, I think, made a number of times, that 70% of British law ultimately emanates from Brussels. From UKIP's point of view, that's a good reason to be out, restoring sovereignty to the British Parliament.
Well, yeah, look, I don't want to be in a federal United States of Europe. If it looks like we're going into that, I want to see us leave the European Union, but we're not in that at the moment. This renegotiation will, I think, show once and for all whether we actually have a say and are able to control our own destiny in Europe. And I believe that we will be able to get renegotiation, get powers back, and basically be able to focus on the internal market, which I think is key for the country, and not the rest of it. So if that's the case, I would support us being in if we get that renegotiation. Now, in terms of this 70% of law, European law is made very differently to British law, and often it's very technical on very, very sort of technical issues that often affect 10, 15, 20 pieces of legislation in the UK. So I think all the potential options of whether they're 75% or 7%, all potentially could be right, because actually the problem is it's a lot of technical law, but dealing often with not so many huge issues that here end up changing a lot of our legislation.
That's Dan Dalton from the Conservatives. Now, while we've been chatting in the studio, political reporter Castan Cheshin has been out and about at Drayton Manor, asking people what they think about the elections and the issues being debated. Kath.
Hi, Adrian. Yes, all the fun of the fair here at Drayton Manor. I just have been having a go at the lobster pot, which I'm not very good at, which is when you throw a ball in there. Visitors from all over the West Midlands here at Drayton Manor, as well as the rest of the country too. A lot of indifference. I've been chatting to them this morning. A lot of people saying they're not that interested, they probably won't vote. But some people do have some strong opinions too.
Will you vote in the European election?
Of course, yes.
You say that, but a lot of people have no interest whatsoever.
I think it's extremely important, particularly these days, with what's going on in Europe and what's happening back home, jobs, etc. And you have the political parties all taking different approaches, different views.
Who are you thinking about voting for?
Oh, I wouldn't like to say at this stage. I've always voted one way, but this year I'm voting completely different.
Will you vote in the European election? Why not?
Because I feel that they're all the same anyway. That, you know, as far as I'm concerned, it's their job, obviously, but they're just trying to make what they can make. They're not really interested in anybody else.
But you mean all politicians?
I think they're all the same. I know they all have the different views, but at the end of the day, they're all still... It's just their jobs and they're making loads of money at it.
Do you think we should be in Europe or out of Europe?
I don't know, I haven't really given that a lot of thought, I'll be honest with you. I just get on with my thing and that's that.
There you go, Castan Cheshin out and about at Drayton Manor today. Mike Nattrass from An Independence from Europe, sighing heavily there when you heard that lady saying she hadn't given it a great deal of thought, Mike.
Well, it's a shame because generations have fought for independence in this country, and if we can just give it away on that basis without even thinking about it, I think that's a very sad sign. And I do think that as we are a world trader, we don't need the EU. We can trade with the EU and with the world and without complying with all these EU regulations, because these days, of course, the World Trade Organization has its regulations and we can freely trade throughout the world and it won't make any difference to our EU trade. So obviously the answer to your question is yes, we should leave the EU and make Westminster responsible for our regulations, which at the moment are killing us in the West Midlands.
And Nikki Sinclaire from We Demand a Referendum Now. I'm assuming you'll agree with Mike?
Well, yeah, but I think we're putting the cart before the horse. Let's get a referendum so we can have this debate. I think it's pointless us arguing about it now when actually the real debate is about getting a referendum. Now, when David Cameron got elected as Prime Minister, he headed up the coalition. He gave a speech and said, I'm going to stop banging on about Europe, probably thinking about the last major government that was racked by the issue of Europe. And I said no to that. I read the coalition document and I started that 100,000 petition that went all the way to Parliament. Mike helped with some of his funds to help support that. But it was a cross-party campaign. We went to Downing Street. We forced the issue. For the first time in the history of this country, we brought a Prime Minister to the dispatch box. And 220,000 signatures were forced that debate in Parliament. That 81 Conservative MPs rebelled against their government. Guess whose signature of those 220,000 signatures wasn't there? Nigel Farage. UKIP refused to support that campaign, and that's the only thing that's actually forcibly put David Cameron on the dispatch box. Then 81 MPs voted, Conservative MPs, and since then it's been David Cameron. So by re-electing me, and you said, Sean Simon said no MEP can make a difference on the referendum. Actually, I'm an MEP that actually has made a difference in this country by forcing that debate, and by re-electing me, Nikki Sinclaire, you will get someone who will proactively campaign for a referendum on this country sooner rather than later.
Nikki, thank you. Jim Carver from UKIP then have been accused of not backing these calls for an in-out referendum.
Adrian, let's be very clear on this. Let's be very, very clear. The only reason that the Lib Lab Con are really seriously thinking about the issue of Europe now is because of the political pressure that UKIP have put on. I'll give you one tangible thing. 24% UKIP achieved across the board in last year's county council elections. It is about political pressure because UKIP is in a situation now where we really can offer a change to our country. We believe in a future for Britain outside the European Union. The Lib Lab Con have staked their political reputation on Britain's membership of the European Union. And if you really want to change in a global future for our country, on May the 22nd, look for the UKIP logo near the bottom of the ballot paper.
OK, thank you, Jim Carver from UKIP. I think our listeners are intelligent enough to understand your names and which parties you represent without any of you turning it into a party political broadcast. Phil Bennion, then, representing what is regarded as the Lib Lab Con by Jim Carver. So you're chuckling away at that. Come back to the core issue here, in or out?
We need to stay in for inward investment. If you look at the big global investors across the world, they're investing more than anywhere in Europe in the United Kingdom. And they're investing here because we're inside the single market. Yes, there's a few things that need to change. We need to make the regulations more suitable for small businesses. This is why we in the Liberal group have been pushing forward the SME test. And
what's the SME test?
The SME test is looking at every single piece of regulation coming out of Europe and asking the question, is it suitable for a small business, not just for the big businesses? And there's something called Refit, which is looking at all of regulation systematically, bit by bit, and we are pushing that through to deregulate a lot of areas for smaller businesses so that they can continue to create jobs in the way that they have. And another point is that I agree with Dan in that it will become a more variable European Union. We're not in Schengen, we're not in the Euro, so I don't think it's a question of all in or all out. I do think we can renegotiate, but not for Britain, a renegotiation for all. And this is because as we have enlarged, as the European Union has grown, it has become more necessary to look at different areas. I mean, I think we've gone too far on giving Europe some powers over labour laws. I mean, Sean would disagree with me over that. But what we see generally is the UK, and this is where Mike is wrong, the UK tends to regulate even more than the European Union does. We tend to gold plate everything, and I would like to see UK government stopping the gold plating too.
OK, Phil Bennion from the Liberal Democrats, Will Duckworth from the Greens.
Can I just add very quickly, we can't protect the environment on our own. We need to be in Europe and Europe fighting for within the rest of the world.
What about that point about labour regulation, Sean Simon from Labour?
Well, it's one of the things that the EU has been doing, playing its part in alongside British governments for a long time. But the key point to remember about this election is that if you think we should be out or you think we should have a referendum, you're best off signing Nikki Sinclair's petition, because nothing that you do in this election can have anything to do with that. This is about mobile phone charges, cheaper flights on aeroplanes, water quality, flood defences. That's what this election is about.
OK, Sean Simon, thank you. Let's get a little more of an upsum of what people have been saying on the text and on Twitter with our reporter James Boville.
Yeah, plenty of text and tweets this morning. Thanks for getting in touch. Lee says, why has this turned into an in-out debate? That's a national, not an EU decision. Discuss European issues, please. Simon says, we joined the EU in the first place for trade purposes, did we not? Not to be told by Brussels what we can and can't do, and for them to govern our law. Let's get out now. It won't affect trade. We're an island. We should be independent from Europe. Dan says, I still don't think I want to vote for anyone. No one is saying anything clever or with sense, just bashing each other. And Mike says, I didn't know who to vote for before this debate, and I'm now even more confused listening to all of the guests. Someone help me.
Thanks very much indeed, James Boville. So I don't know whether we've shed light in this debate or whether we've cast doubt. I'm not honestly sure. But listen, keep your comments coming all across BBC Radio Shropshire, BBC WM and BBC Coventry and Warwickshire. And I'm sure there'll be a lively ongoing debate on Twitter following this conversation. And it will also be available on the iPlayer shortly after we go off air. So I want to thank everybody who came in today. To Dan Dalton from the Conservatives, many thanks to you. Many thanks to Sean Simon from Labour, many thanks to you. Many thanks to Phil Bennion from the Liberal Democrats. Thanks to Jim Carver from UKIP. Thanks to Will Duckworth from the Greens. Thanks to Nikki Sinclair from We Demand a Referendum Now. And many thanks to Mike Natras from An Independence from Europe. As I say, we did invite Michael Coleman from the BNP, but he was unable to attend. And there are other candidates as well standing in the Euro elections here in the West Midlands. I'm Adrian Goldberg. This has been a European election live debate broadcast from the mailbox in Birmingham, going out on BBC WM, BBC Radio Shropshire and BBC Coventry and Warwickshire. Many thanks for listening. Many thanks to all of you who joined in our debate on the text and on the Twitter. I know we had many contributions in. We couldn't read all of them, but we are sincerely grateful for everyone who took part, and especially for our live panel who joined in today. I do hope you've enjoyed it. My name's Adrian Goldberg here on BBC WM, BBC Coventry and Warwickshire and BBC Radio Shropshire.
For more information about the European elections, log on to bbc.co.uk/